You know that feeling when you're trying to wrap your head around some big, complex topic.
Yeah, you want those aha moments, right? But sometimes it just feels like information overload.
Exactly. We get it. And that's pretty much why we do the deep dive. We sift through, well, a whole lot of stuff.
Different sources, reports, articles.
And we pull out the really crucial insights, the things that matter, and, try to make it clear for you.
That's the aim. Help you get properly informed, quickly, without feeling totally overwhelmed.
So today we're diving into a really interesting collection of essays. It's called Smart City Barcelona, the Catalan Quest to Improve Future Urban Living.
Okay.
Our mission, basically, is to unpack the key ideas here about urban development, innovation, and what smart city really means, at least through the lens of Barcelona's own journey.
And it's quite a journey. This collection touches on everything from deep history to these really ambitious future plans.
So let's get started. Barcelona is a fascinating case, isn't it? They really position themselves early on as a leader in this whole smart cities thing.
Oh, absolutely. They were seen as pioneers, even exporting their model internationally,
Yeah.
getting a lot of attention.
They were definitely riding high. But then 2015 happened, the local elections,
Right, and they lost. The book calls that a real lesson in humility.
a big one. So that loss, even though it was apparently quite narrow,
It became a major turning point. Ada Clau, the new mayor, her team, they came in with a totally different approach, much more grassroots campaigning.
focusing on social rights
Yeah,
and a different communication style.
exactly. More direct, less traditional politics. It really shook things up.
It seems like that political shift really reshaped how Barcelona thought about the smart city concept itself, led to this idea they call social smart cities. Okay, let's unpack that. What's the core idea? What makes it social?
So the big shift, the key insight here is moving beyond just the tech itself.
Yeah.
It's about using that technology to actively improve daily life, well-being.
For everyone.
For every resident, yes, especially focusing on maybe the more vulnerable people. The book gives this example, Mrs. Carme in Rias, an example.
I remember reading that bit.
Yeah, an 85-year-old woman living alone. The point is, a truly socially smart city needs to make sure someone like her feels supported, connected, has the resources she needs.
That paints a much more human picture, doesn't it? Technology serving people, not the other way around.
Exactly. But, the book doesn't shy away from the reality of cities either, that inherent chaos you find everywhere.
Right, you mentioned Mumbai, Lagos, LA, Bogota. Cities aren't neat, ordered systems, are they?
Not at all. They're messy, complex, diverse, and that's where the smart part can come in, but maybe not how you first think.
How so?
Well, smart cities offer tools, data, algorithms, analysis to help understand that complexity, to manage it, maybe anticipate things, adapt better.
So using data to, say, design public spaces better,
Yeah.
or manage traffic flow.
Precisely. Using detailed information to make more informed decisions within that chaotic reality.
Okay, but here's a tricky part the book raises, this potential pitfall. What happens when the smart concept is mainly pushed by companies just wanting to sell their tech solutions?
Ah, yes. That's a critical point. How do you make sure it's actually serving the public good?
And not just, boosting corporate profits.
The authors really stress the need for informed public officials. They call them genuine clients,
Genuine clients, meaning
meaning officials who truly understand their city's needs, and just as importantly, why those needs exist. They need to be savvy consumers of these smart solutions.
so they can ensure the focus stays on delivering better public services.
Exactly. Not just buying the latest shiny tech because a company pitched it well.
It's about being smart consumers for the city. Okay, interesting. Now let's shift gears a bit. The book also really digs into the importance of history and identity. This isn't just about futuristic gadgets.
Far from it. A really powerful example they give is the project at Turó de la Rovira, the old anti-aircraft batteries.
From the Civil War.
Right. Used for defense then, but later it actually became a makeshift home for families struggling with poverty. Now they've regenerated it
Into what?
into a space for memory, for reflection, reconnecting with that difficult part of the city's past, recovering that identity.
That's powerful. The author even shares some personal memories, don't they? About Madrid after the Civil War.
Yeah, vivid stuff. Artificial limb shops, bullet holes still visible, wasteland turning into ring roads. It paints a picture of how deeply conflict marks a city physically.
And that contrasts with Barcelona's own layers of identity. The author mentions meeting an old CNT veteran in the 60s or 70s.
Right. And how that revealed this whole working class history tied to the Republic and the Civil War, which is maybe different from the typical tourist image of, Gaudí and the grand boulevards.
It shows there are multiple stories, multiple identities within one city.
Absolutely. Layers upon layers.
And speaking of Barcelona's planning history, the book brings up Ildefons Cerdà, his 19th century plan for the Ensanche district.
Ah, Cerdà. Yes.
They frame him almost as an early, smart thinker. That's fascinating.
It really is. His plan was incredibly forward-looking for its time. He was thinking about public health, like Monlau pushing to tear down the old walls for better hygiene.
Down with the walls. Yeah.
And embracing new tech, the Barcelona-Mataró Railway, the Industrial Institute, plus prioritizing mass transport.
So way ahead of his time.
Definitely. The book calls him a smart engineer avant la lettre before the term even existed, because his focus was on data, on planning, on improving urban life in a structured way.
And the Ensanche itself, that famous grid plan.
That grid is iconic, isn't it? Those uniform blocks, the focus on light and air, green spaces within the blocks. It was revolutionary for urban living back then.
So Barcelona clearly has this legacy of, well, smart planning in its DNA.
Yeah.
How does that connect to more recent smart projects? The book highlights Plaça de la Glòria Catalana.
Glory is presented as a really key example of this modern smart phase. Driven by data, focused on creating social value, it was a huge project.
They demolished that massive elevated road junction, right? Which must have been controversial.
Hugely complex. It involved demolishing a major traffic hub and needed real agreement between the city council and the local residents.
And it wasn't just about knocking things down. They had this interesting strategy, open up for works.
Exactly. That's a key detail. They deliberately set aside budget for provisional development. Meaning making temporary improvements while the main construction was happening. So instead of just a huge, messy building site for years.
They tried to make parts of it usable.
Right. Little parks, community spaces, using every corner they could for public benefit, making the construction process itself more engaging, less of a blight.
That's clever. Making the disruption itself somewhat productive.
Yeah.
The book also talks about glories becoming a kind of 21st century agora. Why that specific word?
Well, the agora in ancient Greece was the heart of the city, wasn't it? The central public space for everything, politics, markets, social life, religion.
Okay, the main square.
Pretty much. So by using that term, they're signaling the ambition for glories to be a vibrant, modern hub for community, connection, maybe even economic activity.
And they link it to more recent examples too, like Zuccotti Park, Tahrir Square.
Yeah, drawing that parallel to modern movements reclaiming public squares as places for expression for people to feel ownership of their city.
Right. Okay, let's tackle another big urban challenge, housing. The book mentions this figure you hear a lot, 80,000 empty flats in Barcelona.
Yes, that number.
But they used smart analysis,
Right.
big data, to look into it. What did they actually find?
They used their CityOS platform, basically this big integrated data system for the city, to get a much clearer picture.
Was it 80,000?
Well, the analysis showed the number of genuinely empty available flats was much lower. That 80,000 figure often came from just counting properties where no one was officially registered.
Which could be for lots of reasons, right?
Yes.
Second homes, people working elsewhere.
Exactly. The book argues the real problem wasn't so much vast numbers of empty flats sitting idle, but more a fundamental lack of sufficient housing stock overall.
Which drives up prices and makes it hard for people.
Precisely. So the point is, the city needs accurate data to understand the real issues, like needing more affordable housing, and then figure out how to help people, like the fictional Patricia they mention.
Using data to target solutions effectively. Got it. Now, moving from housing to something even more ambitious, the superblock concept. What is that exactly?
The Superblock, or Superilla in Catalan, is described as this program for both urban and democratic regeneration. It's more than just a physical layout.
Okay, so what are the goals?
It's a whole framework, really, aiming for things like productive local neighborhoods, shifting priority from cars to people pedestrians, cyclists.
Human speed, they call it.
Right. Plus energy self-sufficiency, better digital connectivity, aiming for zero emissions, improving quality of life, equity, culture.
Yeah.
It's very holistic.
Wow, that's a lot packed into one concept.
Yeah.
They mentioned Les Courts as a prototype.
Yes, Les Court was one of the early pilot areas where they tested these ideas.
It sounds incredibly integrated. The book also mentions a condensed cities model. How does that fit in?
Condensed cities seems to emphasize the importance of mixing uses within urban areas, so having residential, commercial, leisure spaces intermingled.
Not strictly zoned areas.
Exactly. Along with well-designed public spaces that are also adaptable over time, they point to the example district again, Cerdà's grid, as a successful historical example of this kind of mixed-use, adaptable density.
Creating vibrant, multifunctional areas. Okay. We've talked a lot about data, planning, social goals. Where does the actual technology fit in all this? The book insists it's a tool, not the end goal.
Yeah, that's a constant refrain. Technology has to serve a purpose.
Can you give an example?
The perfect one they use is Grandma Maria's button, part of the Winkles project.
Winkles?
Yeah, it won awards, recognized as a top global smart city initiative. It's basically a simple tech device connecting elderly people who live alone to a support network.
So a literal button they can press for help or connection.
Essentially, yes. It's technology directly tackling a social problem: loneliness, isolation among the elderly. It's tech serving social progress, not just tech for tech's sake.
That really clarifies the social aspect.
Yeah.
Okay, the book also introduces this acronym, DIDO.
DIDO. Data in, data out.
What's the idea there?
Think of the city itself as a kind of living data system. It takes in data from all its operations, learns from it, and then outputs better services, better decisions. It's about moving away from a linear process.
As opposed to
the old PI2 model they mentioned, products and trash out. The traditional industrial city model of just consuming resources and producing waste. DIDO implies more circular, adaptive learning system.
like a new industrial revolution, but based on data flows.
That's how they frame it, yeah.
And for this kind of data-driven city to work, what about innovation and talent? The book seems wary of traditional hierarchies.
Absolutely vital. Innovation and talent are key. And yes, they argue that rigid, top-down organizational structures can actually stifle creativity.
So less bureaucracy, more flexibility.
Kind of. They quote this motto from a Bishop Dague. Fair, 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 dixar fair.
Which means?
Work, promote work, let others work. It's about enabling action, fostering initiative, not getting bogged down in rigid processes.
Letting people get on with it, basically.
In a productive way, yes. They also highlight things like the Fab Lab Ateneo di Fabricacio, places where families learn digital manufacturing skills, preparing people for this future of, hyperconnectivity and the Internet of Things.
Building skills for that DIDO city. Okay. Now, no city planning happens without challenges. The book brings up Robert Moses in New York.
The classic comparison, Moses versus Jane Jacobs.
Right. How does that relate to the smart city approach? What's the contrast?
Well, Moses represented that kind of grand, top-down, often intuition-driven planning. Big projects, highways carving through neighborhoods.
Which Jane Jacobs famously criticized for destroying the social fabric, right?
Exactly. The smart city approach, at least in theory, is meant to be more data-driven, more evidence-based. Using analysis to understand the complex impacts on neighborhoods before you build the highway, potentially avoiding those unintended consequences.
So data as a check on potentially flawed intuition.
Perhaps. Or at least a way to have a more granular understanding of what's really happening on the ground.
Like using big data to manage tourism's impact. They mentioned Sagrada Familia. That's a huge issue for Barcelona, surely.
Oh, massive. For an icon like Sagrada Familia, big data lets the city analyze things like visitor flows, traffic congestion around it, how it affects local residents' daily lives.
And then use that info to do what?
To try and mitigate the downsides. Maybe adjust traffic patterns, manage tour bus access, inform policies on short-term rentals nearby, support local businesses differently. It's about using data to find that balance.
Balancing tourism benefits with livability for residents. Makes sense. Energy self-sufficiency also comes up as a really big goal. Why is that so central to the smart city idea here?
It's framed as crucial for a few reasons. One is resilience and political independence, less reliance on external, potentially volatile energy sources.
Okay.
But it's also tied to a new industrial model based on renewables, moving away from fossil fuels. They mention Copenhagen aiming to be CO2 neutral by 2025 as a benchmark.
So it's environmental, but also economic and political.
Very much so. A pathway to a different kind of urban economy.
And within that, the book specifically flags electric buses. Why buses in particular?
The argument is about flexibility and lower infrastructure costs compared to, say, building new tram or subway lines. Electric buses can adapt routes more easily as the city changes.
Less disruptive than digging up streets for tracks.
Exactly, and cleaner, quieter. They even mention the idea of intelligent stops, providing personalized info. It's about adaptable, clean public transport.
There's also this anecdote about a discussion in Barceloneta, the old fishing neighborhood.
Yes, Barceloneta. It really highlights that classic tension, doesn't it? Between preserving a neighborhood's character and history and embracing the changes that come with development, especially tourism.
Because Barceloneta changed hugely with the Olympics, the beaches.
Right. It brought economic benefits, but also huge pressure on the residents and the traditional way of life. Finding that balance is incredibly difficult.
It seems like a recurring theme. Interestingly, the book draws a parallel with China, balancing growth with social services.
Yeah, it points to China's efforts or stated goals, at least to balance rapid economic growth with improving social safety nets, education, and even cultural recovery.
What's the lesson there for Barcelona or any city?
I think the takeaway is that development can't just be about the economy, it has to be holistic. You need to consider social well-being, culture, quality of life alongside GDP growth. Smart decisions involve that broader picture.
Which maybe connects to this idea of micro-urbanization they mentioned,
Right.
connecting the big vision to small, tangible things.
Exactly. Micro-urbanizations are like small-scale, local projects that deliver visible improvements quickly.
So people actually see something changing in their neighborhood.
Right. It builds trust, shows that the big smart city plans aren't just abstract concepts, but actually lead to tangible benefits in people's daily lives. It connects the long-term vision with short-term reality.
It's interesting that the Guardian newspaper gets a mention, supporting energy self-sufficiency.
Yeah, the book notes their backing for distributed energy production.
Why is that significant?
Well, having a major international newspaper endorse that idea lends it weight. But the deeper point is about distributed systems like the internet being potentially more resilient and democratic than centralized ones, less vulnerable to single points of failure or control.
So distributed energy production challenges centralized power, in a way.
That's the implication. It fits with this broader theme of empowerment and resilience.
And finally, wrapping back to history, they mention projects like the gates to Collserola and that Turó de la Rovira site again,
Yes, bringing it full circle.
showing how these smart initiatives, using tech and new thinking, can actually help reconnect with the city's past.
Precisely. Revitalizing historical sites, making them accessible, using modern tools to tell their stories. It's about weaving the past into the future, strengthening that shared identity.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the single most important takeaway from this look at Smart City Barcelona?
I think the core message is that smart cities, at least as Barcelona is trying to enact it, are fundamentally not about the tech itself. It's an evolving approach.
Dynamic process.
Yeah, a dynamic process that tries to blend historical awareness, really thoughtful data analysis, new technologies, but all with this underlying commitment to social progress, to inclusion, and ultimately to making life better for all the people living there.
It's definitely a complex picture. This dive gives you a real sense of the possibilities, but also the challenges in trying to shape cities for the future.
For sure. It makes you think about how these ideas, these tensions play out in our own communities, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it leaves us and you with a pretty big question to chew on, I think.
Which is,
How can we really use all this data, all this technology in the best possible way? How do we leverage it to create cities that are genuinely more equitable, more sustainable, more vibrant?
yeah,
Cities that truly work for everyone who calls them home?